The night Marcus Webb walked into that small Italian restaurant on Clement Street, he was not looking for love. He was not even looking for conversation. He was looking for a quiet corner table, a bowl of pasta, and enough silence to forget that 3 hours earlier, his editor had rejected the manuscript he had spent 4 years of his life writing. He was looking for the kind of solitude that only a crowded restaurant can offer, minus the paradox of being invisible in a room full of people. He was 37 years old, recently divorced, professionally humiliated, and wearing a shirt that still had a coffee stain on the collar, because he had stopped caring about things like that somewhere around the 8-month mark of living alone. He was, in every measurable sense, a man at the bottom of himself. And then the hostess sat a woman down across from him at what he thought was an empty table, and everything minus every quiet, carefully constructed wall he had built around his life, minus began, without warning, to tremble. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and the idea that the right person can walk into your life at exactly the wrong moment, minus please like this video, leave a comment below telling us what you think is about to happen. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to this channel so you never miss a story that might change the way you see the world. We create content for people who still believe in the power of human connection. Now, let's get back to Marcus. He had arrived at Piccolo's at 7:15, 15 minutes after his friend Daniel had texted him saying he had made a reservation there and was sorry he could not make it. But Marcus should go anyway and eat something because Daniel had known Marcus for 20 years and understood that grief, even professional grief, made him forget to feed himself. What Marcus did not know, minus what Daniel had deliberately and carefully not mentioned minus, was that the reservation was for 2 people, and the second person was already on her way. Her name was Elena Vasquez. She was 34 years old, a pediatric nurse who worked 12-hour shifts at St. Francis Memorial and spent her days off reading novels she bought from the used bookstore on Haight Street and taking long walks along the waterfront with her golden retriever, a ridiculous, beautiful animal she had named Hemingway. She had agreed to the blind date because her sister Rosa had begged her, because it had been 2 years since her last relationship ended, and because she had made a quiet promise to herself on her last birthday that she would stop treating her own heart like a museum minus something to be preserved and protected and never touched. She was nervous in the way that intelligent people are nervous, not about the meeting itself, but about the hope that inevitably comes with it, and the possibility that the hope would once again be wrong. Marcus had already ordered a glass of red wine and was staring at the bread basket with the focused vacancy of a man thinking about something else entirely when she walked through the door. He noticed her the way you notice weather, minus not as a conscious observation, but as something that changes the temperature of the room. She was wearing a dark green dress, and her hair was pulled back loosely, and she was scanning the restaurant with the careful eyes of someone who had learned to read rooms quickly. He looked back at his bread. He did not think she was relevant to his evening. He was catastrophically wrong. When the hostess guided her to his table and she sat down across from him, Marcus assumed there had been a seating mistake and offered a polite, distracted smile before returning to his wine. It was only when she tilted her head slightly, looked at him with an expression that mixed amusement with something softer, and said the words that would rearrange the furniture of his entire life, minus words that landed somewhere between a question and a declaration, minus that he understood. She smiled, and it was a real smile, one that reached all the way up and changed the shape of her eyes, and she said, quietly and warmly, that she thought he might be waiting for her because she was his blind date, and she was sorry she was a few minutes late because the parking on Clement Street was an absolute nightmare, and she hoped he had not been waiting long. Marcus stared at her for a moment that lasted somewhere between 2 seconds and the rest of his adult life, and then, without fully understanding why, he laughed. Not a polite laugh, a real one, the kind that comes from somewhere unguarded and unexpected, the kind he had not heard from himself in so long that it sounded almost foreign. He told her minus still laughing slightly, still shaking his head, minus that he had not known about any blind date, that he had come here to eat alone and feel sorry for himself, and that his friend Daniel was apparently a more complicated human being than he had previously given him credit for, and Elena, rather than being offended or awkward or retreating into the polite disaster that blind date conversations so often become. Laughed too. She laughed easily and genuinely, and she said that her sister Rosa was clearly operating from the same playbook as Daniel, because she had also been told this was a casual dinner with a friend, and she had specifically not been told it was a blind date because Rosa knew she would have said no. They sat there for a moment, two strangers who had been maneuvered into each other's orbit by people who loved them, looking at each other across a table covered with a white cloth and a flickering candle, and the absurdity of it minus the sheer, beautiful absurdity of it minus made the evening feel less like a mistake, and more like something that had been arranged by a force neither of them fully understood. What happened over the next 2 hours was not dramatic in any cinematic sense. There were no grand declarations. No. Sweeping romantic gestures. What happened was quieter and more extraordinary than that. They talked. They talked the way people talk when they have accidentally forgotten to be careful, minus when the situation is so unexpected that the usual social armor has not had time to be assembled. Marcus told her about the manuscript rejection, not with bitterness but with the raw, honest exhaustion of someone who has stopped pretending. He told her that he had written the book about his father, who had died of Parkinson's disease 3 years ago, and that he had spent 4 years trying to get the story right, trying to find language that was worthy of a man who had been extraordinary in the quietest of ways, and that the rejection letter had been kind, but definitive, and had suggested the work was too personal to be commercial. He said this, and then looked down at his pasta, and was surprised to find that saying it out loud hurt less than it had all afternoon, when it had been rolling around inside him like a stone. Elena listened with the full, unhurried attention that was, she told him later, both her professional gift and her personal one. She listened without interrupting, without rushing toward comfort, without doing the thing most people do when someone shares pain, which is to immediately try to fix it or redirect it. She simply held the space for what he had said, and let it exist without trying to shrink it. And then she told him about her own loss minus about her mother, who had passed 18 months ago from a stroke that came without warning on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, and how she had been at work when it happened, and how the guilt of not being there had taken a long time to metabolize into something she could carry without it breaking her posture. She told him that she had read somewhere that grief is just love with nowhere to go, and that it had taken her almost a year to understand what that meant, but that when she finally did, something in her had shifted, not healed exactly, but reorganized itself around the loss in a way that allowed her to move forward, without feeling like she was leaving her mother behind. Marcus looked at her across the table and felt something he had not felt in a very long time. Not attraction, though that was present too, quietly and undeniably. Something deeper than attraction. Recognition. The specific, rare feeling of sitting across from someone who has been to similar interior territories and carries the map in the same way you do. He had been so alone for so long minus not just since the divorce, but in the way that some people are fundamentally alone even within relationships, even within friendship, because they have never found the person whose frequency matches their own minus. And in that moment, in that small restaurant with the candles burning down, and the other diners lost in their own evenings, he felt the aloneness shift, not disappear, but move slightly, the way a heavy piece of furniture moves when someone finally helps you push it. They stayed until the restaurant was nearly empty and the waitstaff was doing the quiet, diplomatic work of encouraging the last remaining guests toward the door. They walked out onto Clement Street and stood in the cool San Francisco night, and neither of them wanted to be the one to say goodbye, because goodbyes, they had both learned, have a way of becoming permanent when you least expect it. Marcus told her that he was going to go home and look at his manuscript again, not to revise it immediately, but just to look at it differently minus with the eyes of someone who had been reminded, over pasta and red wine and brutal honesty, that a story told from the deepest part of the truth is never wasted, even if it takes longer to find its way to the people who need it. Elena told him that she thought his father sounded like a remarkable man, and that she hoped she would get to read the book one day. The way she said one day was not a pleasantry. It was a small, quiet promise. Marcus heard it that way. He carried it home with him like something fragile and necessary. He did revise the manuscript. It took another 8 months, and the revision was not structural but emotional. Minus he found the places where he had been holding back, where the writer's instinct for craft had overtaken the son's need to simply tell the truth, and he opened those places up and wrote into them without protection. He sent it to a smaller, literary press that he had always admired, but never approached, because he had told himself they would not be interested. They were. The book was published 14 months later. It was not a bestseller, but it found the people it was meant to find, and those people wrote him letters minus actual, handwritten letters minus telling him that his father, through the pages, had somehow helped them with their own. And that was the point. That had always been the point. Elena was there the night the book arrived in its first printed form. She had been there for many nights by then, minus the ordinary nights and the difficult ones, the nights when Marcus's faith in himself collapsed and needed rebuilding, and the nights when her work brought her home carrying a weight that no one who has not held a sick child's hand can fully understand. They had built something together in the way that real things are built, minus slowly, imperfectly, with constant negotiation and occasional failure, and the steady, unglamorous work of choosing each other again and again, in the face of every reason not to. Hemingway, the golden retriever, had accepted Marcus with the generous and slightly dignified tolerance that golden retrievers extend to people they have decided are acceptable. This, Elena told him, was the highest endorsement available. There is a version of this story where the coincidence of that evening, minus two people arranged into the same table by two separate friends who were operating. It turned out, in secret collaboration, a scheme Rosa and Daniel had hatched over text messages the previous week, minus is treated as the magical part. But the magical part was not the coincidence. Coincidences happen every day and lead nowhere. The magical part was the choice that came after, minus the choice to stay at the table when leaving would have been easier, to speak honestly when silence would have been safer, to open a door that both of them had quietly decided, in their separate griefs and their separate solitudes, might never again be worth opening. The magical part was that two people who had both been hurt by the world looked across a table covered in white cloth and a flickering candle, and chose without guarantee and without certainty to believe that this time it might be different, that they might be the exception to their own learned caution, that the heart, despite everything, still knows what it is doing. And if this story touched something in you, minus if Marcus and Elena reminded you of yourself, or someone you love, or some version of hope you had almost stopped believing in, minus, please take a moment right now to like this video, share it with someone who needs a reminder that it is never too late for a second chapter, and leave a comment below telling us the one word that this story made you feel. Your engagement means more than you know. It tells us that stories like this matter, and they do. Before this story ends, we want to ask you to leave a comment with just one word, minus the one word that lives in your chest right now. After hearing this, just one word. Let the world see it. Because somewhere tonight, there is a person sitting alone in a restaurant with a coffee-stained collar and a rejected manuscript, and a heart that is fuller than they realize. And somewhere tonight, there is someone walking through the door who will sit across from them and smile and say something that changes everything. The world does this sometimes. It rearranges itself without asking permission, and all we have to do, minus all any of us ever has to do, minus, is stay at the table long enough to find out what comes next.